It was hard and physical, but the friendships and the comradeships that was made outweighed all the physical and tough working conditions that we had to put up with.
You know, as doctors, we was part of the group, and that was your identity. And still today, if they say to me, "What are you?" I'll say, "I'm an ex-doctor."
Hello, we are from Riverside Primary School. We have been working with Westminster Cathedral Primary School on a project to explore the history of the people who worked in the London docks.
We have been interviewing people about their lives on the docks to uncover this fascinating part of London's history. We hope you enjoy our film.
Dockers have existed since the beginning of time. As soon as you're transporting things by water, someone's got to unload it. The work always had to be casual because you could never predict when a ship could arrive. From the very beginnings, what happened is that people who needed some casual work would just hang around by the dock gate, and a foreman who wanted a ship unload would just come outside and call them on or get them to come involved. So the call on became something, everyday part of life in the docks, that you would stand on the stones, they called it, behind a chain, and literally wait for work.
And the foreman would have these tokens in his hand, and he'd stand up in this box, and there would be all these men looking for work for the day or the week or whatever, depending how long the ship was there. And he would have these tokens, and he would say, 6 dockers on a sugar ship in wherever. And then all these hands would go up. And then he'd say, you and you and you and you, and they'd come up and they'd get their token, and that meant they could go and get some work. And then other times, if they was a nasty foreman, he might just get them and throw them out. And so people had to get on the floor to try and find a job.
It was really quite literally the survival of the fittest. If there wasn't much work going, people could often be fighting to get to the front to get a day's work. They paid them money that wasn't enough to feed their kids. So they went on strike for a thing called the Dockers' Tanner to get a living wage. And it was amazing how they managed to garner a lot of support. And because they actually won that fight, they established a bit of power for the workers in Docklands. And after that, it was much more difficult to push them around.
The London Docks complex, stretching from St Catherine's down to Tilbury, 26 miles of docks, were the biggest docks in the world up to the 1930s.
It was the East End of London, and you had a royal group of docks in Canning Town area, which was the largest docks in the world at the time, contained 4 docks, but they grouped as one. And then about a mile away you had what called the Millwall docks, and in the centre of where I lived actually was a dock called the Old East India Dock. So the whole area was surrounded by docks, and so really and truthfully everybody in that neighbourhood relied on docks for a living.
If you go up towards London Docks, the North St Catherine's, you can smell the spices. You know, at dusk, about 6 o'clock at night, you can smell the spices and what have you. If you go to West India Dock, you can smell the rum and the noise of the docks. Chains going and things like that. Crowded with boats. You go to all the different docks, all boats in there, all different sorts and sizes, you know.
We'd be burning dirty fuels. There'd be a lot of pallor of smoke hanging over everything. Everything would be grimy, dirty. There'd be a lot of cranes swinging about, great big cranes, and sort of ships just gracefully lining up. Ships going into the dock, ships coming out the dock, ships waiting to go in, lighters full of cargo, and just tens of thousands of mainly men, working, getting everything moving, stuff coming in, stuff going out.
If you didn't work in the docks, there was factories everywhere around Custom House and Canning Town, and you'd work in a factory that could be doing something for the docks, ship repairing or providing supplies and one thing or another.
The area I grew up, yes, it was just a typical East London area. Where I grew up, everybody knew everybody. And the actual street where I first lived, all my family lived there. And in fact, the street I lived in, I had 16 cousins lived in the same street.
It was like a village because everybody knew each other. There was local schools, local shops, and you knew your neighbours and your friends' families. So it was like a little village in the middle of London.
We lived in a community where everybody was very poor, basically. And so the only way families survived was by supporting each other. Was that if somebody died in the street, then all the neighbours had a collection. And dockers was very prevalent within the community. A lot of people who lived in our environment were dockers.
We had if I can recollect, Mrs. Turton, I remember her name. And she was a lady, she was like a grandmother. She lived about 3 doors along from us. And she would always be sitting outside knitting. But basically she was keeping her eyes on us, or the kids, because we played in the street. And she was aware of everything that went on.
My dad's cousin, Peter, when he left the docks, he started looking into the archives of our family, and he traced us right back to someone called Cornelius Long, who settled in the East End in Whitechapel originally, briefly, and then out to Poplar in about 1843. So that's where we Longs came from.
You know, you always felt, I think you felt a bit special. Your dad was a docker anyhow, you know, your dad was a docker.
My dad was a stevedore, and as I followed him later, my mum done various jobs on the island, varying from working in sweet factories, paper mills, canteens.
My great-great-granddad was an engineer in Millwall Dock. His son was a dock labourer. My granddad was a stevedore. My dad was a stevedore, and I was a stevedore in the docks.
I remember the big, large walls around the docks, so we never saw inside the docks. So all I remember is the men lining up for work outside and then going through the gates, and that was it until they came home from work. So the docks was a bit of a mystery as I was growing up.
It was part of way of life. The docks were a part of way of life for you. Whether you was thieving off the barges as a kid and selling what you got, especially peanuts in pier just from here, Cherry Garden Pier. I fell in the Thames twice.
Well, it was a fun place because we played on the river, swim in the water. You couldn't buy a pair of shorts then, you didn't buy shorts, maybe costume, you couldn't afford it. And so your mother used to knit them. You swim and all of a sudden they start stretching down here, right? And so what we used to do was, it's ridiculous, this is, soaking wet. And we used to take them off, right? And sling them. In the early days, in the late 40s and the 50s, you had a lot of American tourists, you know? And so we used to stand there going, starkers, no clothes on, going, hey, you like that. Of course, the Americans, they went, look at those poor East Londoners, look, no, poor children, no clothes. They used to throw us money.
It affected our childhood because my dad relied on work there, which wasn't always guaranteed. So it was nice to see when there was big ships in the docks, because then we knew that Dad had quite a lot of work to do. But if there wasn't many ships in, we knew that, you know, he didn't have work that day. So we were sort of always looking towards the docks to make sure they was busy.
Then war, total war, came to London. The target was everything and everybody.
The original target on the 7th of September 1940 at 6 o'clock at night, with 500 German bombers with fighter escorts come over, and the beeline was the docks. It was quite easy because you're following the river, you know, so you're strafing a corridor of 20 miles wide and just come along and just bombing all over the place. It went on for 58 days, that went on for, or 58 nights, you would say.
What all the dockers and the people worked in the dock, They had to brave it because this is Britain's food supply. They couldn't decide they weren't going to go to work. They had to turn up there.
So the Isle of Dogs, a lot of people, especially the children, were evacuated. And so the island was a bit of a ghosty place, I understand, at the time, you know?
What happened was, as I said, I was evacuated, but then in 1940, there was a line in the bombing, so I was brought back to London. So I lived throughout the Blitz. And it affected the docks a number of ways. I mean, I can remember standing with my dad, and when the bombs used to drop, they also had what they called incendiary bombs. So if they landed somewhere, they caused a fire. I can remember standing watching barges floating down the River Thames alight, where the incendiary bombs had hit them. And many houses were blown up, in actual fact. I mean, I can remember once, to give an example, we went to stay in this shelter, and we left our house, beautiful house on the corner. When we came out of the shelter, the house wasn't there no more. It'd been hit by a bomb and was completely destroyed.
Unfortunately, around about 1940, my grandmother, all the family, 8 of my family were all killed together at the same time. So I've been with a sort of happy merry-go-round sort of family to nothing. And like you know, it's taken me 70 years to get over it, really, because I still think of them at times. You don't ever forget, you know, little things that crop up every now and again.
After the war, the Labour government created a national dock labour board. They wanted to kind of rationalise the docks. They wanted to try and bring in more security for lots of the workers that work within them. So they created this registration scheme, and this meant that only a registered dock worker could apply for work. They still had to kind of stand on the stones in the morning and wait for the call on. But if they weren't picked for work, it meant they still received a basic minimum wage. They weren't going to have nothing at all. Their families weren't going to go without for that day.
And you got paid the grand total of, if I remember right, of £7.10, but that's what you got. It was called the fallback money. But if you was working, you could earn anything between 20 and 30. Some blokes earned £30, £35, depending on what cargo.
You went on what you used to call the call, but because you was unknown, like you would have a foreman one side of the road and all the men would be this side of the road, and he would walk out and say, I want 10 men. And you thought, oh, I've got half a chance here, but he would go over your head and take the books that he wanted of people he knew, so you might not get work for a long while.
If it was a dodgy job that no one wanted, then you could have easily got a job. But if it was a good job, you didn't have much chance. In fact, when I went in there early on, people would push and shove. In fact, you'd get punched, basically, to get a job, if they thought it was good.
But eventually you got known, you might go on a job. Once they see you could work hard, you got different jobs, you was picked up.
When I went to work, you know, people would say to me, like, you know, well, whose boy are you? You know, and you'd say, like, you know, oh, Benny Holmes. Oh, well, Ben, you know, you was all right. If your father was a good and you was a good, and until you did something to make them, you know, think, well, he's not as good as his dad, or he's not like his dad.
The gang would come out, I want 6 men. Yeah. And at the end of the week, if you worked a week, you give them £1. Yeah, thank you very much. He's earned £8, so he's earned money, and he earned a fortune, the ganger.
You worked in gangs in the dock, you had 7 in your gang normally. My family's gangs were made up of family members. Occasionally they'd let an outsider in, but namely it would be the Longs, so it'd be the Long gang. And my grandfather was one of several brothers, and they were a real bunch of characters. You would join a gang of men and everything would be manhandled, you know, hooks and bales and barrows, derrick, you know, small cranes and derricks, larger cranes on the dock side.
The first memory of docks is I went to work in the docks in 1950, and I turned up for work the first day, and my dad told me I was on strike. There's a problem with the Canadian seamen, and so the docks was on strike. So I didn't work for that week, I was on strike. If your family was known in the docks, then you were sort of selected. Everyone knew you. And what I did, same as Georgie did, I went with my father for a few days, or a few weeks. Not the first week, because I was on strike, but the following weeks I was to follow my father and show me what to do. And then you get to a stage later in life where you break away and make your own ends, and you went different ways for your father.
Well, as I say, it was my uncle. He said they're taking on people. Would you like to join? I said, yeah, thanks very much. So that was it. He took me up to the union, and they interviewed you, and then you got the letter to say that you've been accepted.
It's a family tradition, so I followed my grandfather and my dad and become a stevedore in 1964.
In the early days, again, I picked a job up in the docks when I was about 17 or 18, known as the Shore Gang, which was when vessels came in and dock in London, or in the Royal Docks, what we worked in, the crew would be paid off, and they would put up what they call a temporary shore gang. And you would store the ship up, clean it up, and do everything that gets it ready for sea for when the permanent crew come back. And then you'd go on to another job in the same on another ship in what was known as the shore gang.
But as far as the training to be a docker was, it was the older men in there used to show you this, show you that, tell you where you should be standing, because it was a dangerous job. If you were standing in the wrong place, you could get hurt. A lot of people did get hurt.
People had ways of working. You know, you'd look at a big case that's going to go in what they call a cupboard. This is underneath, down the ship's hold, and in the cupboard, and you think, where are you going to get that in there? Well, you get old dockers, or, you know, they'd rig up a bit of this and a bit of shackle there and everything, and hook it onto the crane, and the crane driver would pull it up, and that rope would taut, and it would push the case underneath.
The first couple of jobs, as I say, was on the quay, and it was, I always remember it was, you had a wheelbarrow, and you go into the shed where all the cargo was stored, and they would put tea chests on the barrow, and then you go out and you had to march it out, and it was going in barges to go to somewhere else, some one of the wharves or up the river.
Well, there's numerous different jobs. So even the dockers' jobs were broken down into different kinds of work. So stevedores were organising the loading of ships, so cargoes from this country that were going to be exported. It's incredibly skilled men. So if you load a ship wrong, you endanger it. So they had to make sure that cargoes were evenly loaded, but also they had to be skilled in something like geography. Because if a ship doesn't just call at one port, it might call at 4 or 5 different ports in different parts of the world. And when the ship arrives there, the cargo needs to be readily or easily unloaded. If the stevedore in London puts the cargo in the wrong spot, you can imagine when it arrives in a port in Africa, how angry people will be if they literally have to unload everything to get to what they need and then have to put it all back in the ship. So they had to know where the ship was going, where things should be. So that was a really skilled job.
So they would have to make sure that ship was packed right, because otherwise when the ship hit heavy weather, the cargo would slide about, and that would make the ship unstable and could be very dangerous and might even cause it to sink.
You had people who drove what they called a crane, the crane that lifted the cargo out of the ship. So you had people driving a crane. You also had the ship itself had what they called derricks in it. It was a form of a crane that was the ship carried everywhere. You had people driving those. You had people driving what we call electric bogies, and they would carry things. You had people, for example, who would be making the ropes. The gear that you used was made on the docks itself. So you had people working what they called the gear shed. They would make the gear that you was going to use. You could have people that was, all they did all day long was load lorries.
And then you'd have what we call the top end, who directed the crane driver.
And if he was asking the crane driver to lift, he just used to go like that, and if he went like that, that would stop. And then he'd come up, all stop. And so that was very important. And that was usually the foreman, your ganger.
A ship worker, to explain to you, is like a foreman on a building site. We just had a different name for it. It was called a ship worker. He was the foreman for the whole ship.
But you also had jobs inside the shed, which they usually give to older men, perhaps men who had accidents. So if the cargo was damaged, they used to repair it. So all types of jobs, really.
Timber was a big cargo for south of the river in the Surrey docks, and the people that worked there were called dill porters, and they were incredibly strong men and very skilled. They could carry 3 huge planks on their just on their shoulders and balance them. Sometimes they had to run with them almost to unload them.
In my own particular instance, I'd done a lot of work in wharves, because what you've got to remember is, although we talk about the docks, 5,000 dockers were employed in wharves. What that meant was little side loads that worked outside the docks. And I used to work between the docks and wharves.
A lot of the women sort of worked in the factories, especially for Tate and Lyle and McDougall's, sort of local name firms that are still around today. They used to work in those factories mainly on the docks. And also there was timber firms as well.
My sister worked in the docks, and so I went and joined her there, and it was doing work the same as the men, on the saws and all the machinery, and you loaded the wood up, massive big wood, it was very heavy, and that was loaded onto the boats, and went off to sea whatever country it was going to. It was hard work, but it was enjoyable. Not so nice in the winter, very cold, because it's all open. So you had several pairs of stockings, well, it was stockings then, we didn't have tights, it was stockings, a couple of pairs of stockings on, and you had woolly vests and all sorts of things. Sometimes I even put my dad's long johns on to keep me warm in the winter. We used to sit and have our tea breaks, and you'd have the rats running around you. But you was scared of them at first, but you got used to them. And I stayed there until I got married.
His earnings were pretty good if he had work, but it wasn't brilliant, and that meant, because my dad's earnings wasn't very much, my mum had to work. So when I was growing up, my mum worked and my nan looked after me if I wasn't at school.
As I say, if you didn't go to work, you got £9. If you went to work, so if you was on an ordinary job and you'd done 4 days, you might get £16, £17 in a week. If you was on a really good job and you was lucky to get 5 days out of it, you might get 30 quid. There's periods where we had so many ships in the dock that they would tie up alongside one another, and when you finished that one and he pulled out, the other one came onto the quay and you start on that one. Then there was other periods of time with seasonal work, and there'd be no ships in there, and everyone would just be going down there, what is called like dabbing or bumping on. Sometimes that lasted weeks where there wasn't any work.
With the dockers, it was relied mainly on what weight you can. So if the cargo was very heavy, it was a good job. Say sugar, for example. You could handle 200 tonnes of sugar in a day quite comfortably. But if you had other cargo, like anything light, you'd only 80 tonne. So based on that, that's how it would be. But we had a rate book, and everyone knew the rates that they would occupy and that they could use.
The thing is with dockers, you're paid piece rate. So if you're paid piece rate, if you want to earn as much money as possible, you've got to earn quickly. That's the whole purpose at that time. But if you work quickly in that kind of work, you're going to work dangerously.
I mean, some of the things you think now you wouldn't do it, but you used to climb over the edge of a hold onto a ladder and then go down, and you'd be down in, there'd be 8 guys down the ship's hold, like 4 corners of 2. You're in the slave where you're going to have to work. You know, you're down the ship's hold and you're working on butter or whatever you are.
The saddest thing is when someone dies when you're working. I remember working on a job, and it was a butter job, and I was on the quay, and as the load went up, it banged on the side. You know, I said to you that you go under, but this chap didn't. Fell down, smashed, killed him. And usually, people who was working in the vicinity went home.
The East End then was a close community, as I said, yeah, and everybody was associated with dogs. So if someone got killed or badly hurt, you knew them. And it wasn't like a stranger being hurt. It was like a friend being hurt bad. And that really did affect people very much.
They was antiquated then, because the docks were built at the turn of the century. The Royal Victoria Dock, I think, was built in Victorian times, and the other docks were built in Edwardian times.
It took years before they ever give us a pair of gloves to wear on certain commodities. All we had was the hook, what we used to use to turn over cargo or pick up cargo. If you was on a dusty, dirty job, you was never given a mask. That was unheard of, giving people masks when we first went in there.
Mrs. Webber, who lived round the corner from me, her husband worked on asbestos, and she used to wash his overalls. She never went to work in her life, but she washed his overalls, and she died of asbestosis. A
lot of my friends and mates are now reaping the consequences of working on those killer dusters, and particularly asbestos, where we're losing no end of them still today after all them years.
Lots of old dockers wore what they used to call a shtuck, which was a scarf tied twice around their neck. I don't know if it was to soak the sweat or whatever it was. Always had a cap on to go to work, and he had his hook, the docker's hook.
You got to remember, there was no uniform. There was nothing like you do protective clothing today. You did nothing like that at all. You had your cap, and you tied your trousers up around here to stop, not only to stop getting wet, but stop the rats running up as well, up the trouser legs if you're working in the various places. But no, but the cap. You look at the old pictures of the dockers with their caps on. And few things. What you used to do, they used to keep their sandwiches. If they had sandwiches, they put them in the cap, you know, because they couldn't leave them lying around because other people would pinch them, yeah? Or the rats would get hold of them, so they kept them in your cap.
The only washing that you could do if you had a dirty job was a tin bucket with some hot water in it. And if you remember, there was 12 or 13 men in a gang. By the time you got to the 13th man, the water was probably dirtier than you were.
Toilets were non-existent, really. It was up against the wall or whatever. The smell ate me more than anything.
There was a thing called the iron lung, which was the urinal, where everyone would go for a wee. And this thing apparently was just like, you know, it's just a big round steel container that you go in and it would, you know, do the job. And one day it was gone, and my dad said, you know, where's the iron lung gone? And they said, oh, I've taken it to New York. It's going to be part of an avant-garde art installation. I don't know if they were pulling his leg or not, but who knows?
You can go to work, and if you want to become a beast of burden and just be miserable, you can be it. But if you want to go to work and have a good time, you can do it.
I could not wait for my eyes to open to go to work. Now that might sound strange, but I couldn't, because I just laughed. Some of the things that went on, you know.
And I can remember one occasion we were loading beer, and also we were loading some pianos in the far corner. So what they decided to do was take the piano out of the case, have a few drinks, and everyone was singing and dancing, just like a party down the ship's hold. So they all got suspended for a day and they couldn't go to work no more.
If you was at work, and it was a decent job, you would work till about from 8 o'clock till 11:45. If you had any money, you would go to the nearest pub and have 2 pints, or maybe 3. Go back to work at 1 o'clock till 6 o'clock, and then you would go to the pub again, have what you used to call a swift half, which was 2 pints, and then go home. That was a typical day if you was working. If you wasn't working, if you was dabbing, they'd all wait till 9 o'clock or whatever, and then all go over to the nearest rec and have a game of football, because you didn't have any work.
Different sectors in the docks had their own football teams. I played for the West India Millwall Docks. My brother played for the India Millwall Dock. There was the Royals, they had theirs, Tilbury had theirs, the London Dock had theirs. They were the dock teams. And it wasn't only in football, it was cricket. It was lots of sports. We used to play in a national cup that as a docker you'd strive to win, called the Newlands Cup. We won it 1 year, but we was the main size was Liverpool. We used to go all over the country and play different dock sides, you know.
Great nicknames for each other. They'd pick out something that made you unique as opposed to everybody else, and you'd be called that nickname. But it was camaraderie, it was fun, nobody took offence at it. It was how we lived.
We had one fella down there, don't ask me why, but he was called No Go George. Why he was called No Go, I don't know. There is a reason why, but I never got to the bottom of it. But then they started calling him the Assassin. And they said, oh, the Assassin's working with us today. So why they called him the Assassin? Apparently his mother-in-law had a budgerigar which used to get on his nerves, and he killed it.
I think one man was called Psycho. I think he had a bit of a temper.
Without saying too many names, I remember a guy called Sidney Wow. He had come into work and said, I wrote a play. You know, and you think, oh yeah, have you? You know, he said, yeah. And he said, we're going to act it out down the ship. So, and he'd go round, he'd call you, you'd be the footsteps, you'd be the knocker, you'd be the door, and he'd read this story out that he'd wrote about. I was walking down the road and he'd say, and you've got to go clip, clop, clip, clop. And he'd say, I'll knock on the door, you're the knocker. You go, bang, bang. You know, and the ganger are shouting, you going to send any sex? So he was going, well, just fun.
And then there was another bloke who used to be always wanting to look into the cargo, and they'd say, oh, what's in this case, what's in this case? And they called them the solicitors, because they was always looking into cases. So,
yeah, we had a man down the dock, Johnny Boom was his name, and he was a ganger, yeah. And he used to have men working down the hold, and he never took his hands out of his pockets, yeah. And we called him the educated foot, because what he'd do, he'd be standing there with his hands in his pockets, and a case had come over, and he'd say to the men, we'll have that one over there, or that one over there. So his nickname was the educated foot.
So cargoes were really varied. He talked about all sorts of things. He'd lift cement, he'd work sugar, nappies, he mentioned, violins, whiskey bottles by the million.
Well, there was we was a general cargo dock really, so we handled anything. A lot of it was frozen, New Zealand lamb, butter, and then with Australia apples. They was lovely clean jobs, and what was good about them is how long they lasted. Nice and clean, you could get, you know, a fortnight's work out of them, and they was quite well paid.
I worked in a wharf. There was 22 men who worked in this wharf. There was 2 gangs of 11, and we worked on what they call long iron. You know, the long iron bars that go into the buildings and everything else. And that was a wharf that dealt with long iron, and it used to come out of the little coaster ships, used to fetch it out. Dangerous working down the hull, you know, again piecework with all its dangers, you know, work as quickly as you can and everything else. But my father-in-law made sure that I took his job, which was on the quay. So when the big long iron used to come out of the ship on the chains, up the crane on the chains, and coming over, they used to fetch it. They used to hit a wall to turn it round. The wall used to go like that, but you were out of the way. Those guys down the ship, so they worked dangerously.
You know, if you had the job on the quay delivering meat, that was a good job. You was in the open, because the chaps down the hatch, they was refrigerated, so it was still cold. And so if you was on the quay, land, barra, backwards and forwards all day, and you'd be chatting all the way along, that was good. That was a good job.
The grain work we did was quite easy in a way, because you used to put a pipe over the barge and it used to come out, what they call shoot loose, you know, like come out with a big force, and you'd put so many tons in the back end of the barge and shoot some in there, and you'd have to know what tonnage the barge could take, and that was quite very quick, and you didn't have to do too much manoeuvring the hatches and all that. It's all good. That was easy job, yeah.
That's what's called a docker's hook, and they've got different curvature. If it was bag work, they would use one hook because it went into a bag. If it was frozen meat, they had another hook with a different hook on the end.
A lot of machinery used to be exported. I've even seen the big old steam engines lifted aboard. They put them on a barge and take it outside the ship and lift it aboard. That's usually what they call deck cargo. You know, one of them big old steam engines going out to places like Africa and all that.
Off St Albans, we was doing a job once, God knows, couple of animals, and that was an awful job. You know, they just come in sacks and they usually ripped apart. You had to, you know, you didn't have gloves even in them days. You just chuck them back in the sack and chuck them out again. So they wasn't good jobs. And usually a lot of the hardest jobs, dirtiest jobs, was the worst paying jobs.
You know, I can remember my dad having to work on sugar, coming home and more or less flaking out into the armchair.
Cement today, they're not allowed to pick up more than 25 kilos. Well, when we did cement, that was 50 kilos, which was the old days 100 weight. And it was always hot, and it used to burn your wrist, and people used to wrap their wrists and that, because the more you're carrying it every day and you're sweating every minute of the day, and it used to burn you.
There's a lot of talk about thievery in the docks from dock workers. My dad always said, you know, he never, you know, the uncles didn't steal. It was part of their code, really. And he said he didn't, apart from once. And he said all it was that he took was a cashmere twin set suit for my mum, because all these dresses came in, beautiful cashmere, very expensive, you know, he couldn't afford them. And he just thought, oh, you know, my mum would look beautiful in one of those. So he put it on under his clothes, which of course made him really, really hot. And as you drove out the gates, he said the dock police were always looking at you, and every now and again they'd pull someone over, and he said he was just sweating, wishing to goodness that the police didn't pull him over. And they didn't on that occasion. But he said, you know, he never stole anything again after that. Somebody
Stole some steak and put it down his trousers. And it's frozen. When he put it down his trousers, it'd been frozen. But of course, during the day it melted. So he's trying to get out of the gates with his coat over him, trying to stop it. And somebody phoned an ambulance thinking he'd been hurt because he had all blood down his trousers.
At the docks there is a strike that the company don't like. Turn around the out, that's all they'll have to pay. Like slaves they'll have us work far more than in return. Yeah, they make us sweat all our lives out every day. Strike boys, strike for better wages. Strike, strike, strike for better pay. Go and fight in at the docks, stick it out like by the cocks, fight until the bosses give away.
The unions were extremely important. Trade unions have been sort of up and down from about the 19th century, but by the late 19th century, the dockers have got very organised, And it had just come around because their working conditions, they were being asked to work hours and not be paid enough to live on, all in the interests of profit at the end of the day, of the owners. So, you know, there is power in a union. They would down tools and say, we don't work until you start treating us better. And by the time my dad joined the docks, you couldn't be in the docks unless you're in the union as well.
You talk about dock gate meetings, unofficial meetings, but even the branches were really well attended. Really well attended. They called it bath night, Friday night. You went, and if you didn't go, you got found. You know, you go to your branch meeting.
Before the unions got active, before 67, we had no pension scheme in the dock at all. We had no sick pay. So we were able to get all those things for the employer.
We made sure that people that came into the docks, lorry drivers, or anybody who wanted to come into the docks, were members of a trade union, particularly so the Transport and General Workers Union, who covered lorry drivers. And we used to ask a lorry driver to produce their card. If someone didn't have a card, well, he got unloaded, but he got unloaded well late.
The unions would never come to us and say, look men, you need this, you need that, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It was always us who had to go to the unions and say, we want you to do this for us. And by the time they got round to doing it, it was too late. So that is why most dock strikes wasn't with the blessing of the union. Most dock strikes were unofficial. But as soon as I went on strike, yeah, I would take over looking after the children, or my child at the time, and my wife was permanently registered at a temporary office workers agency, and she would get a job. So we still managed to pay our mortgage, to pay the bills, but we was fighting for something.
There'd been a few reports into the dock industry, and but the Devlin one came about to do away with casual working, where people didn't know where the next penny was going to come from, and all the unrest that was causing.
Rather than having to line up for work twice a day, as in the early days, they got guaranteed work. And that was the best time, is that my dad knew that he had a guaranteed wage. Whether the ships were there or not, they was going to pay them because they turned up for work. So it wasn't their fault if there wasn't a big ship in that day.
If you'd done 10 tonne or 100 tonne, you still got the same money. So that changed things quite a bit, really. And you was given an employer, so there wasn't the same dogfight to get a day's work.
The other thing we insisted in Lord Devlin inquiry, that there should be medical facilities within each dock. And one of the things, well, some of the few things we insisted on that time was that we would have protective clothing, had 2 pairs of boots with steel toe caps in, because there were a lot of accidents where things fell on people's feet. The other thing we insisted on was we had large blocks built where there would be lockers in, the men could lock their clothes away. And also there would be showers and washing facilities. When men were always rushing and running around doing this, when we brought these things in, it brought a different atmosphere. The men themselves seemed to be more wanted to do things better. Because what happened, under piecework, it was very dangerous. Because you were rushing around everywhere, trying to do things as quick as you can, that brought a calmness in the dock as well. And you couldn't describe the difference between the two.
My dad really enjoyed working in the docks at the end because he was able to use more machinery and it was cleaner, and they also used to have the big cruise ships come in, so it's quite interesting work as well. So it wasn't just sort of food or cars coming in, people were travelling on their holidays from the docks, so it was a very lively docks.
So towards the end, my dad said it was quite an easy life in the docks. You had forklift trucks. So very often you'd be charging people for 7 men and you'd only have 3 because you only needed 3, so the other 4 would go home.
containerisation did make a big difference. But one of the big differences before that was what we called pre-slung cargo or palletisation. You know, when we used to say unload timber, which was in the Surrey docks, every piece of timber was single. So you'd put 2 ropes down, load all the timber into it, tie it up, crane would take it up. All of a sudden, when you went on the ship, the people had already put these strops on. So all we had to do was put it on the crane. So of course that was unbelievable how quick that was.
A thing called the Bevan Report came out, and it was all around the automation in the docks. They're talking today about robots replacing everyone. And the idea was these big container ships would come with the big containers, and you just didn't need men to unload them. You needed 1 man and 1 crane. So it was, you know, good for the owners, because these big steel boxes, no one could steal anything from them. The ships could carry, you know, thousands of these things on a ship a mile long, and that ship couldn't get up to the London docks. So it threatened the livelihood of the docks and ultimately did away with it. So there was a lot of striking over that.
I can also remember when I was about 5, the big dock strike in 1972, because it went on for a long time, the best part of 2 months, and it was really hard, because as soon as the strike started, all my dad's wages were stopped. And I can remember him telling me that my mum went to Social Security to try and get money for us to feed us, because we needed to get some money in, and the government stopped that, so he couldn't get any money in whatsoever. So what my dad had to do, he had to moonlight, which meant he had to go and work on building sites. The strike really was based around one of the loading facilities that had been created outside of the Docklands area. It's called Chobham Farm. Whereas if you worked within one of the London docks, you had to be a member of a trade union. At Chobham Farm, there were no unions. So this meant that people who were working there, the safety and the security that the unions had campaigned of for years, that fight, you know, wasn't going to be reflected in the conditions that could be found there. It broke the agreement made between the docks and employers, and it threatened dock work, so that the unions organised a picket, which turned into a huge dispute, which threatened to become a national strike. In the end, what they did is they arrested some of the dock leaders there that were organising the pickets. And at this moment, we came very, very close to a general strike. But in the end, the government backed down and they let out what became known as the Pentonville Five. It seemed like there was a victory there, but you could call it a Pyrrhic victory, because really everything in dock work had changed and nothing can be done really to stop the juggernaut which containerisation was. It was something that that in the end there was nothing to do that they could do or the dockers could do to stop that.
The docks was at the end of its life. Everything has a lifetime, doesn't it? And the docks were just too small to handle the bigger ships that were being built.
They didn't need all the ships and the quays and the wharves, because they had mechanisation and containerisation.
Well, when they closed, it was just it was like the domino effect. It would start off in London docks, then it just moved along. So then you'd have, say, the Surrey docks closed, then the West India docks, Millwall docks, and then it come to the Royal Group of docks. We closed in 81, and we moved to Tilbury, which was about 30 miles away.
It wasn't so much the docks closing. The docks closed in 81, the Royals, but there was all ancillary industries around the docks. All of a sudden you started seeing CAFs close, and the people who used to supply goods to the dock for, say, ship repair, because all them ships had running repairs the same as any machinery, and they started closing.
But the worst effect it had, because those, in the days when I'm saying about, the community was all family orientated. All your family, all your friends, you lived in one street. When the dock closed and people were finding difficulty to move down different areas, they then moved, sold their houses and moved further down. So your whole community was destroyed as well.
They closed the docks down by, first of all, dangling huge redundancy money in front of the people who were port registered workers so that they would take the redundancy money and leave. And when the number of dockers on in the port was much smaller and obviously weaker, the trade union had been weakened, then they were in a position to sell off loads of the old port areas without much opposition from any of the unions.
And then really in '89, we was, as I said, we was registered dock workers. So we come under what was called the National Dock Labour Board scheme, which was introduced in 1947. And the Prime Minister of the day, Maggie Thatcher, she abolished it. And we knew if she abolished it, that would give the employer the right to hire and fire. And sure enough, where we worked in Tilbury, I was a shop steward, and they compulsory sacked 150 of us.
So his company folded up in 1982. So what happened is the Kuwaiti Investment Group bought the company he was working with, which was a profit-making company. It was doing fine. Everyone was earning reasonable money, but they weren't interested in the company. All they wanted was the land that they owned. So this is the beginnings of property speculators taking over Docklands.
And sure enough, one day they went down and the docks was chained up, and that was it. So my dad took severance, which meant when you left the docks, they paid you some money and you went away. And it was quite a lot of money, as I remember. His mum went to a beauty salon, and my dad said he'd never seen her look so beautiful as when she came out of that.
More of a banking area now. There's businesses and banking, computers. My dad still works on the docks. He's a pierman with the commuter boats that go up and down the river. They take people to work now, so where he used to take sort of sugar and cars and things off boats, now he makes sure people get safely on and off boats.
It was the end of an era, it was the end of a way of life. Just a real shame. Just a real shame, and a real shame for the community and the industry.
We miss it. We miss the camaraderie. We miss the sense of community. We miss the thing about common goals and common pursuits and amazing sense of humour. That often the sense of humour got people through lots of bad times.